The doctors had called it. Lena Williams was gone. Her pulse had flatlined and her body had gone cold. But what the world didn't know was that Lena wasn't finished yet. In those final moments, something far beyond human understanding occurred. As her life slipped away, she saw him, Jesus Christ, standing before her, his eyes full of purpose. "You must return," he said, his voice shaking her very soul. "For whom?" Lena had asked, bewildered. "For Donald J. Trump," he replied. And just like that, her spirit was thrust back into her broken body. She awoke in the sterile hospital room, breathless, overwhelmed, but with a clear message burning inside her. The fate of America and the world rested on the shoulders of one man, and she had been chosen to deliver a warning. Lena Williams was only 27 years old when her life was cut short. Diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia, her body had been steadily weakened over the course of a year. Treatments failed, hope dwindled, and on one quiet night, as the hospital monitors flatlined, Lena breathed her last. She had been surrounded by family, her mother holding her hand, whispering prayers. The doctors, after a futile attempt to resuscitate her, gave up. But Lena wasn't gone. Not really. Her journey had only just begun. In the moment of death, Lena found herself not in the darkness she had expected, but in an overwhelming expanse of light, the kind that felt like it had no beginning or end. She could not describe it except that it was eternal. Then came the voice, not from a distance, but deep inside her, vibrating through every fiber of her being. "Lena!" She turned, her heart racing in a way she hadn't felt in years. There, standing before her in radiant light, was the figure she had only known through Scripture, Jesus Christ. His presence filled her entire being with warmth and peace, but there was something else there too, something that hinted at urgency. "Do not be afraid," Jesus said. "You are not here by chance." Lena trembled, her mind trying to process the impossibility of it all. "I'm dead. I was just gone. Wasn't this my time?" He nodded, his eyes filled with an infinite understanding. "It is not your time yet. You have a purpose still. You must return. A message needs to be delivered." Lena's heart pounded. A message? For whom? His gaze softened. Donald J. Trump. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Donald Trump? She could barely comprehend the idea. The former president of the United States? What on earth would she, a simple woman from Ohio, have to say to him? But before she could ask any more questions, Jesus spoke again. His path is at a crossroads. The world does not know the darkness that seeks to devour it. You must warn him. You must help him prepare. Lena shook her head, panic beginning to set in. But why me? I'm just one person. You are chosen, he interrupted. Now go. Time is short. In an instant, Lena felt herself being pulled away from the light, descending rapidly back into her earthly body. She gasped, the sterile scent of the hospital room overwhelming her senses. She blinked, trying to focus as nurses and doctors scrambled around her. For a brief moment, it felt like nothing had changed, except everything had. Her body felt different, alive with a force she couldn't explain. Her soul had returned, and so had the message. She had no time to waste. Lena's miraculous resurrection was reported as a miracle. The media and doctors were baffled, declaring her story one of the most unexplainable phenomena in medical history. But to Lena, the truth was clear. She had returned for a reason. She began with research, trying to find any connection to Donald Trump, but the task seemed impossible. She wasn't someone who could just pick up the phone and speak to a former president. She had no political ties, no influence. But she wasn't giving up. She started writing letters, emails, anything she could think of. But each attempt was met with silence. That was until one night, as Lena sat in her small apartment, exhausted from her relentless attempts to reach Trump, a notification pinged on her phone. It was a message. I can help you get to him. Lena's heart skipped. The message came from an anonymous source. Someone knew. They knew what she was supposed to do. Before you dive deeper into Lena's dangerous mission, do you believe that God's hand truly moves in mysterious ways? If you think Lena's story is just the beginning of something extraordinary, hit like and comment with your thoughts. Stay tuned for more, and don't forget to subscribe for the shocking twists ahead. Lena followed the cryptic instructions she received. They led her to a small diner outside of Washington, D.C., where a man in a dark suit was waiting for her. His face was solemn, but his eyes carried a depth of knowledge that seemed to confirm everything she had been told. You're Lena Williams, aren't you? The man asked. I've been watching your journey. You have a message, and I'm here to make sure you get to Trump. Lena stared at him. How do you know all this? How is this even possible? The man smiled cryptically. Let's just say I work for people who understand the importance of your mission. Now, here's what you need to know. Your message isn't just about Trump, it's about the fate of America. It's bigger than you can imagine." Lena nodded, fear and determination mingling in her heart. She had already come back from death itself. What was there to fear now? The man handed her a burner phone. "Follow the instructions, you'll get one shot." Several weeks later, Lena found herself standing in front of a mansion in Palm Beach. Security was tight, Secret Service agents eyeing her with suspicion as she was led into a grand room. There, sitting behind a massive desk, was Donald Trump, the man she'd been sent to warn. "Miss Williams," he said, eyes narrowing as he sized her up. "I've heard about your story, the miracle. What do you want from me?" Lena stood tall, her breath steady despite the weight of the moment. "I don't want anything from you, Mr. Trump. I've come to deliver a message from Jesus Christ himself." The room was silent. Trump leaned forward, his arms crossed. "I've heard enough nonsense. Why should I believe you?" Lena didn't flinch. She stepped forward and said, "Because you've been chosen for a time like this. A battle is coming, one you can't fight with your own strength. Only through God's power will you stand." Trump's expression softened slightly. He didn't speak for a long while. Finally, he nodded. "Tell me what I need to do." Lena's heart pounded as she spoke. The world does not understand the forces that are coming for you, for America, for the world. These aren't just political battles. There are powers beyond our comprehension at play. You are standing at the edge of a great storm, and if you do not stand firm, everything will fall. Trump listened intently, his usually confident posture now slightly slumped, as if the weight of Lena's words had reached him in a way nothing else had. He was a man used to fighting battles, but this was different. This was a battle of the soul. "There will be betrayals, Mr. Trump," Lena continued. "Those closest to you will turn on you. People will attack your character, your legacy, but you must not falter. You must stand firm, for this is the hour for which you were chosen." Trump's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "What does that mean? Chosen for what?" Lena paused. The atmosphere in the room felt thick, heavy with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were listening. "You were chosen to lead America through this darkness, to preserve what this country was built upon, but you cannot do it alone." Trump sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk. "So what exactly am I supposed to do?" Lena met his gaze, her voice firm, unwavering. "You must turn to God. You cannot fight this with your strength alone. It is not about politics, it's about the heart of this nation and its soul, and you have a role to play." Trump was silent for a moment, his mind racing. He wasn't someone who easily accepted the idea of divine intervention, yet something about Lena's presence and the sincerity in her eyes made him question everything he thought he knew. "What about you? Why are you here?" he asked, his voice suddenly softer. "What do you want from me?" Lena took a deep breath. She had known this moment would come, the moment where she would be asked about her own role in all of this. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I was chosen to deliver this message to you, to guide you in whatever small way I can, but I need you to understand you are not alone in this. There are people out there, forces working in the shadows against you, but there are also those who are fighting with you." Trump's brow furrowed. "Fighting with me?" Lena nodded. "Yes. There are those who know what's at stake, people of faith. They will stand with you. But you have to reach out. You have to take that first step, because once you do, the battle begins." The room was silent again, save for the sound of Trump's breathing. His mind was clearly in overdrive, processing everything Lena had said. In the days that followed, Lena's words echoed in Trump's mind. He was no stranger to battles. He had fought for years in the business world, in politics, in the public eye. But this was something far greater. This was a spiritual battle, a war for the very soul of the country he had led. He began to pray. At first, it felt strange. Prayer wasn't something he had done much before. But every night after the news cameras stopped rolling and the public scrutiny died down, he found himself in his private quarters, on his knees, asking for guidance. "Lord," he would whisper, "show me the way." And at times, he would feel a strange peace settle over him, as if someone was listening, as if he wasn't alone. Meanwhile, Lena's life took a darker turn. Her newfound mission had attracted attention, but not all of it was positive. As word spread about her encounter with Trump and the divine message she had delivered, Lena became a target for those who believed her to be either delusional or a fraud. She was accused of lying, of manipulating the media for attention, and worse, some even claimed she was working with sinister forces. But Lena knew better. She had seen the light. She had heard the voice of God, and no amount of hate could shake her faith. Still, it was becoming increasingly dangerous. Lena received threats, anonymous calls, angry messages on social media. One night, as she was walking home from a prayer meeting, she felt the unmistakable presence of someone following her. Her heart raced, but she didn't look back. She kept walking, trusting that she was not alone. Then she heard the voice, "You're in danger." Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. She spun around, but there was no one there. Still, the voice persisted, clear as day. "They're coming for you." Lena gripped her Bible tightly, refusing to let fear control her. "Let them come," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. She had a purpose now, and no one, not even the forces of darkness, could deter her from fulfilling it. Lena had known from the beginning that the battle she was involved in was far bigger than just her or Trump. There were unseen forces at play, forces of good and evil, each fighting for control of America's future. The media had become one of the most dangerous weapons in this war. As Lena's story spread, the attacks against her only grew louder. The press painted her as a fanatic, a woman deluded by religious fervor. The public ridicule was harsh, but Lena held firm. She was telling the truth, and the truth was what the world needed to hear. Meanwhile, Trump found himself in the middle of a political storm. His enemies, many of them within his own ranks, seemed to close in on him from all sides. The media relentlessly attacked him, labeling him as divisive, as a threat to democracy itself. And yet, through it all, he couldn't shake the feeling that Lena's warning had been right. Something dark was coming for America, something more insidious than anything he had faced before. He couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, after a long day of meetings and appearances, Trump sat alone in his study, staring out at the horizon. The weight of the world seemed to press down on him, the burden of leadership and responsibility more overwhelming than ever. But then he closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he prayed with sincerity. "Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I don't know what to do, but I know that I need your help. I can't do this on my own. Show me the way." He waited. For what felt like hours, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a sense of peace settled over him. The weight on his shoulders lifted, just slightly, but enough for him to breathe. In that moment, he knew. He wasn't fighting this battle alone, and neither was Lena. Do you believe in the power of prayer, in divine intervention? If you're following Lena and Trump's journey, you won't want to miss what happens next. Like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Stay with us as we dive deeper into this spiritual battle that is changing everything. And don't forget to subscribe for the next chapter. Lena's life had never been the same since she met Trump. What began as a divine mission had transformed into a full-blown spiritual battle. As her faith grew, so did the opposition. People started to notice her influence. Some saw her as a beacon of hope, while others labeled her a threat to the status quo. But one thing was clear, Lena was no longer just a survivor, she was a warrior, and the war was just beginning. As the storm loomed closer, Lena knew that there would come a time when everything would be tested. She had warned Trump, she had shared the message. But now, the true battle would begin. The forces of darkness would stop at nothing to silence them both, and they were coming for her next. Lena knew the storm was upon them. The world was changing, and with it, everything she had warned about was starting to manifest. The enemies were not just those of flesh and blood, but forces unseen, dark forces intent on destroying everything good. One evening, as she sat in prayer, alone in her apartment, she felt the air thicken, as though something ominous was drawing closer. It wasn't just fear, it was an evil presence. A feeling of suffocating darkness loomed in the room. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Her Bible, resting on the table beside her, trembled. Lena's heart skipped a beat. "Jesus," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "Protect me." The room went cold, and for a moment she thought she could hear the faint sound of whispering voices, not from the outside world, but from the very air around her. The walls seemed to close in, and then everything stopped, and there he was. The figure of Jesus appeared, not as an ethereal vision, but as though he was standing right in front of her. His eyes were full of compassion and strength, the power of his presence undeniable. Lena fell to her knees, overwhelmed by his holiness. "Lord, please, I don't know if I can withstand this battle alone." Jesus spoke softly, yet his voice resonated with authority. "You are never alone, Lena. I have given you strength for this hour, but the trials are not over. The enemy will strike at the heart of America. You must prepare yourself and Trump. Your faith will be tested, but remember, my power is greater than anything the enemy can throw at you." Lena looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "What do I do now, Lord? How do I help him? How do I stand against this darkness?" Jesus extended his hand to her, his face filled with sorrow. "The enemy has already begun. You will see the suffering of your country, plagues, disasters, division. But through it all, you must hold fast. The battle is not against flesh and blood. It is a battle for the soul of the nation, and Donald Trump has been chosen to lead the charge. Lena stood, wiping away her tears, her heart swelling with resolve. I will stand with him. I will not fail. Then go, Jesus instructed. Go and speak my words. Strengthen your brother in this time, and remember the victory is already won in heaven. Trust in that. With that, the vision faded, and the oppressive darkness lifted from the room. Lena stood there, trembling but filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The mission was clear. It wasn't long before the first major disaster struck. America was shaken by a catastrophic earthquake that rattled the West Coast, leaving devastation in its wake. Cities crumbled, entire neighborhoods were wiped out, and panic gripped the nation. News outlets scrambled to cover the destruction, but amid the chaos, the attacks on Trump intensified. The media painted him as incompetent, blaming him for the disaster, as though he had orchestrated it. Politicians from both parties began calling for his resignation, capitalizing on the public outcry. But Trump was undeterred. When Lena visited him after the earthquake, she found him in the Oval Office, his face drawn and weary. He was staring at a map of the affected areas, his mind consumed by the catastrophe. But when she entered, he turned to her, his eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. You came, he said simply. Lena nodded, her heart aching for him. Mr. Trump, the enemy is not just attacking America, they are attacking you. This earthquake, the chaos, it's a distraction, a sign of the spiritual warfare happening behind the scenes. You must stand firm. Trump clenched his fists. I know, but it's like everything is falling apart. The media's turning on me. My allies are turning on me. It's like I can't win no matter what I do. Lena stepped forward, placing her hand on his arm. You're not meant to fight this battle alone. God has chosen you for this moment, but you need to trust in him. You need to pray. Trump looked at her, uncertainty clouding his eyes. Pray? I've never been a man of faith like that, Lena. You know that. Lena's gaze softened. Then it's time to start. This isn't just about politics. It's about saving your country, about saving your soul. When you pray, you invite God's power into this fight. You can't do it without him. Trump hesitated, his jaw tight. The weight of everything seemed to crush him. But then, as if something inside him shifted, he nodded. All right, I'll do it, Lena smiled. We'll pray together. They knelt in the Oval Office, and for the first time in his life, Donald Trump humbled himself before God. Lena led the prayer, her voice steady and full of conviction. Lord, she began, her voice filled with emotion. We come to you in this hour of darkness. We are fighting forces beyond our understanding, but we know that you are the light, and your power is greater than anything the enemy can bring against us. Strengthen President Trump. Strengthen our nation and lead us through these trials. Trump bowed his head, his eyes closed tightly, as if trying to hold on to the fragile hope that had begun to grow within him. God, please help me. I don't know what to do, but I need your guidance. Show me the way. The room was silent except for their breaths. And in that silence, there was a shift, a peace, as if God had heard them. A faint warmth seemed to fill the room, a reassurance that, despite the storms ahead, they were not fighting this alone. In the weeks that followed, America continued to spiral into chaos. Natural disasters rained down on the nation, hurricanes devastated the East Coast while wildfires ravaged the West. Cities across the country were thrown into turmoil, and the cries for help were deafening. But even as the nation wept, there were glimmers of hope. Trump, armed with newfound faith, began to take a different approach. His speeches became more impassioned, his words no longer just political rhetoric but calls for unity, calls for prayer. He spoke openly about his faith, acknowledging the power of God and asking the nation to join him in prayer. And then, in a remarkable turn of events, the public responded. People from all walks of life, Republicans, Democrats, Christians, non-believers, began to join together in prayer. Churches were filled, prayer vigils were held across the nation. America, broken and battered, began to turn its eyes toward heaven. Through it all, Lena stood by Trump's side, offering guidance and support. The battle had only just begun, but the power of prayer, the strength of faith, was beginning to make a difference. And then came the most unexpected moment. One morning, as Trump was preparing for another press conference, Lena received a call from an anonymous source. They're planning to strike again, the voice said, cold and foreboding. This time it will be worse. But you have one chance to stop it. Lena's heart raced. What do I need to do? The voice was quiet, almost a whisper. You must be ready. The final battle is approaching. Pray, and when the time comes, you will know what to do. Lena hung up the phone, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the end was near. The battle for America's soul was about to come to a head, and it would take everything she had, everything Trump had, to win it. The days grew darker. the tension in the air palpable. Lena felt the weight of what was to come pressing on her chest like 1,000 pounds. Every hour, it seemed, the enemy was pushing harder, digging deeper into the fabric of America. But something had shifted in Trump. He was no longer the man he had been before. The force of his will, tempered with his newfound faith, had begun to shape the course of events. But even with this newfound strength, Lena knew that the ultimate test had yet to come. It was early one morning when Lena received another vision. She was asleep, but in her dreams she saw a battlefield, a grand, overwhelming scene, unlike anything she had ever witnessed. The skies above were dark with clouds of smoke, and on the horizon she saw figures moving toward her. At first, they seemed to be nothing more than shadows, but as they neared, she realized they were far more than mere men. They were soldiers, but not of this world. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, their weapons gleaming like fire. She knew they were demons. A voice, strong and commanding, broke through her fear. "You must prepare. The battle is coming to your doorstep." She tried to turn, but she couldn't. The battlefield stretched out before her, and in the center, standing tall and unwavering, was Donald Trump. His hands were raised to the heavens, his face set in determination. Behind him, Lena saw angels descending, their wings a blinding light. But the dark army was growing nearer, and she could hear the whispers of the demons as they encroached on Trump's position. Lena woke up with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew it wasn't just a dream, it was a vision of what was to come. The battle would not just be fought with words or policies, but with faith. The very soul of the nation was at stake. Lena immediately called Trump's office, demanding an urgent meeting. When she finally arrived at the White House, she found Trump pacing back and forth in his office, his brow furrowed with concern. He had felt it too, the darkness closing in on them, but he had no idea what was about to unfold. Lena's voice was steady but full of emotion as she relayed the vision. "The battle is coming, Mr. President. It's not just political anymore. It's spiritual. I saw the demons. They're real. They're coming for you, for the country, for everything that's good." Trump stood still for a moment, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. Then, without a word, he turned toward the window, staring out at the vast expanse of the White House grounds. His hands clenched at his sides, as though grappling with the weight of the impending storm. "I never asked for this," he muttered, more to himself than to Lena. "I never thought I'd be in the middle of something like this." Lena stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "You didn't choose this, Mr. President, but God chose you for this hour, and now we must stand firm in His strength. The darkness will try to break you, but you have to fight back. We fight with prayer, with faith." Trump turned to her, his eyes searching hers as though he was looking for something he hadn't seen in himself before. "I don't know how to do that, Lena. I'm not a saint. I don't know what it takes." Lena smiled softly. "It takes surrender. It takes faith. It takes believing that you're not alone in this." The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Trump, Lena, and their small circle of allies, both political and spiritual, prepared for the inevitable battle. They prayed together, fasted, and sought God's guidance in every decision. But no matter how hard they tried to prepare, the darkness continued to loom. The media attacked Trump relentlessly, amplifying every misstep, every slip-up. They portrayed him as a man losing control, as a leader who was out of his depth. But even as the attacks grew, Trump stood firm. His resolve had strengthened, and he began to speak more openly about his faith. In interviews, he called for unity in the country and implored Americans to turn to prayer. The public response was mixed. Some mocked him, others rallied behind him, but more and more people began to listen. Then the news came. The storm had arrived. It wasn't just a political storm, it was a literal one. A massive hurricane, unlike any the nation had ever seen, was barreling toward the East Coast. The winds howled with unimaginable strength, and the rain fell in torrents. Cities along the coastline were evacuated, but not everyone could escape. The storm, Lena realized, was a sign. The enemy was coming in full force. But this time, they weren't just targeting the country, they were targeting Trump personally. Lena and Trump stood together in the Oval Office, watching the news coverage of the storm. The winds outside howled, and the lights flickered. "This is it," Lena said, her voice trembling but full of faith. "This is the moment we've been preparing for." Trump nodded, his face grim. But then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he turned to her. "Lena, I'm scared." "I've never been more scared in my life, but I'm not backing down. Not now." Lena placed her hand on his shoulder, her voice filled with conviction. "You don't have to fight alone, Mr. President. We're standing with you, and God is with you." The night was the darkest it had ever been. The hurricane raged outside, the winds shaking the very foundations of the White House. But within, Trump and Lena stood together, praying, asking for God's protection, for wisdom, for strength. The time for talk was over now. The battle would be fought on the spiritual front. As they prayed, the air seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and a strange, oppressive presence filled the room. It was as though the very walls were closing in on them. Lena could feel the weight of the evil forces gathering, but she didn't falter. She had seen what was coming. She knew the stakes. And then, in a sudden moment of clarity, Trump stood tall, his hands raised to the heavens. "Lord," he said, his voice unwavering, "I can't do this without you. I surrender. Lead me through this." Lena's heart soared. She knew that, in that moment, Donald Trump had truly surrendered. The battle for the soul of the nation was no longer just his fight, it was God's fight. The storm raged on, but inside the White House, the battle was being fought on a different front, one not of winds and waves, but of faith and spirit. As the hurricane intensified, a strange sense of urgency filled the air. The media, focused on the natural disaster, was unaware of the greater spiritual war unfolding behind the scenes. Lena and Trump continued to pray together, seeking guidance and strength. But it wasn't just the storm outside they had to contend with. There were darker forces working against them, threatening to tear everything apart. Late one night, as Lena sat in the Oval Office, a sudden chill ran through the room. The lights flickered and she felt it, a presence darker than any she had felt before. She stood up, her heart racing, her instincts telling her something was horribly wrong. Trump, too, felt it. His eyes widened, and he moved closer to Lena, his voice shaky. "I don't know what this is, but I can feel it," he said. Before she could respond, the door to the Oval Office slammed open. Two Secret Service agents rushed in, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. One of them spoke, his voice trembling. "Sir, it's happening. There's been an attack on a church in Texas. Several members were killed." Lena's breath caught in her throat. The news hit her like a hammer. She knew what this meant. This was no ordinary attack. This was the enemy making its move. And it wasn't just an attack on the people. It was an attack on faith itself. The message was clear: silence the believers, destroy the hope of the righteous. Without a word, Lena and Trump rushed to the Situation Room, where the full extent of the tragedy was revealed. The church had been bombed during a prayer service, leaving dozens dead and many more wounded. The news hit like a shockwave across the nation. The images of grief-stricken families, of heroes who had tried to save their brothers and sisters, were broadcast live. The country was torn apart. Lena's heart shattered. She had seen this coming. The price of standing in the light was always the dark's most vicious attack. But even in the midst of tragedy, Lena felt the pull of something greater. The faith of the fallen would not be in vain. Their blood was a seed for revival. Days passed, and the nation seemed to sink deeper into despair. But for Lena and Trump, the death of so many innocent believers ignited a fire within them. Lena, though devastated by the loss, saw the attack as the final sign. This was it. The darkness had revealed its hand, and now the light had to fight back with everything it had. Trump, too, found a new resolve. The attacks were personal now. It was no longer just about politics or power. It was about something far greater. It was about standing against the forces of evil, about protecting the people who had put their faith in him. And with Lena's guidance, he began to understand the deeper meaning behind the storm. The hurricane was a physical manifestation of the spiritual battle raging over America. But just as they began to regroup, disaster struck again. Lena received an emergency call. A close ally, a well-known pastor who had been a strong supporter of Trump, had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. The news hit like a punch to the gut. There were no details, no explanations, only the crushing reality of another life lost. Lena fell to her knees in prayer. She asked for strength, for herself, for Trump, and for the nation. But more than that, she asked for answers. Why were so many being sacrificed? Why were so many innocent lives being lost in this battle? It was in that moment of desperate prayer that Lena received another vision. She saw the figure of Jesus standing in front of her, his face full of sorrow. His eyes were filled with the weight of the suffering that had come upon the world. "Lena," he said softly, his voice filled with compassion, "the battle has only just begun. But know this, every life lost in my name is not in vain. They will be remembered. Their sacrifices will bear fruit." Lena felt the overwhelming presence of peace wash over her, but it did little to ease the ache in her heart. The enemy's attacks were growing bolder, and with each death, the pressure on Trump increased. The media, sensing the rising tide of fear, began to turn on him even more harshly. They painted him as a failure, as a man who had failed to protect his own people. The pressure was almost too much for him to bear. As the days wore on, Trump found himself alone more often than not. His advisors were cautious, afraid to speak the truth to him, but Lena remained by his side. She had seen what was coming. She had seen the way the darkness was trying to break him, to strip him of his faith and his resolve. But she knew the truth. If Trump gave in to despair, the nation would fall. He was the last line of defense. One evening, as they sat together in the Oval Office, Trump broke the silence. His voice was strained, his words heavy with grief. "I don't know how much longer I can take this, Lena," he admitted. "I've lost people I care about. I've lost allies. I've lost faith in myself." Lena's heart ached for him. She understood the weight of what he was carrying. But she also knew that the battle wasn't his to fight alone. "You're not alone, Mr. President," she said quietly. "The battle may be fierce, but we fight in the power of Christ. He is with us." Trump met her eyes, and for the first time she saw a glimmer of something beyond the despair and the burden he was carrying. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady now. "Let's fight." And in that moment, Lena knew that they were no longer just fighting for the future of America. They were fighting for the souls of its people. They were fighting for the light to overcome the darkness. The battle that followed was like nothing anyone had ever seen. The media ramped up their attacks, using every weapon at their disposal to discredit Trump. The nation, divided and torn apart by the storm, seemed to be falling into chaos. But even in the midst of the storm, Trump and Lena pressed forward. They prayed. They believed. They stood firm in the face of overwhelming odds. Then, one fateful day, the final test came. Trump stood before the nation, preparing to address the public. Lena was by his side, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what was at stake. This speech would determine the fate of the nation, and perhaps even the world. As he stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment seemed to settle over him. He knew that everything he had done, everything he had fought for, had led him to this moment. And as he spoke, his words were more than just a message of hope. They were a declaration of faith. "We are in the midst of a battle," he said, his voice strong. "But we will not back down. We will not give up. With God's strength, we will overcome." Lena's heart swelled with emotion as she watched him. This was the moment of truth. And in that moment, they both knew that no matter what happened next, they had already won, because they had stood in faith. And Jesus, in his infinite mercy, had stood with them. Years passed, and America began to slowly heal from the wounds inflicted by the storm, the physical one, yes, but also the spiritual battle that had raged for so long. The nation had experienced a profound transformation. What had once been a fractured, divided country was slowly stitching itself back together. But it wasn't just political policies or recovery efforts that were to thank. It was the deep, quiet work of the spirit of faith and conviction that had carried them through. Lena had become a symbol of unwavering courage. Her journey, from the depths of despair to the halls of power, inspired countless individuals across the nation to stand firm in their faith. She had shared her testimony across every platform, every medium she could reach. Her story of death and resurrection, of visions and divine intervention, had touched the hearts of many. The once skeptical audience had turned into a fervent following, eager to understand how faith in Jesus had played such a pivotal role in the political and spiritual war they had fought. Trump, too, had changed. His presidency had been marked by trials that no one could have foreseen. He had been a president tested not just by the opposition, but by unseen spiritual forces that sought to tear him down. Yet despite it all, he had stood firm, guided by his own growing faith. No longer was he simply a political figure. He had become a man transformed, one who had faced darkness on a scale few could comprehend, and who had emerged with a clearer understanding of his role in God's divine plan. The battles were not over, of course. In fact, many had warned that even though the outward wars were won, the inner battles were still ongoing. Divisions persisted, but they were now met with a stronger force, unshakable faith. Churches across America had seen a resurgence in attendance. People, once passive in their beliefs, were now rising up, praying more fervently than ever before. Families, communities, and leaders gathered together to rebuild not just their homes, but their spiritual foundations. In those years following the storm, Lena found herself continuing to do the work she had started. It was more than just a political mission now, it was a spiritual one. Everywhere she went, from small towns to large cities, she preached a message of hope and redemption. The story of the battle for America's soul had become one of the most widely known and deeply felt testimonies in the nation. Books were written, documentaries were made. The story of her resurrection from death and the message she carried from Jesus to Trump became a beacon of light to those in the darkness. Lena's own life had taken a turn as well. The quiet moments of reflection, the time she spent praying in solitude, had begun to reveal to her an even deeper understanding of the spiritual war she had fought. She had been called to something greater than even she had known. It wasn't just about helping a political leader stand firm, it was about helping a nation return to its true calling. She had become a spiritual leader in her own right, often finding herself in the presence of young people eager to hear her guidance. Their questions were simple but powerful. How do we stay strong in faith? How do we stand against the darkness? Lena knew more than anyone that the fight didn't end with a victory speech. It wasn't over when the storm subsided. The battle for America's soul was one that would continue for generations. And yet, despite the chaos that had once threatened to consume everything, Lena knew there was hope. A hope that burned brighter than ever before. Jesus had shown her that the darkest of times could lead to the most powerful transformation, not just in individuals, but in nations. The years following the aftermath of the storm weren't just marked by rebuilding, they were marked by a growing resistance against the forces that had once threatened to tear the country apart. Lena and Trump, though no longer in the public eyes often, continued to work behind the scenes, ensuring that the foundation of faith they had laid would remain strong for future generations. In the quiet of the night, Lena would often look back on the countless moments of danger, the visions of Jesus, the deaths of so many innocent lives, the political battles, and the relentless storm of opposition. But what stayed with her was the unshakable truth that they had been fighting for something eternal. The battle wasn't just for America, it was for the kingdom of God on earth. Trump, now nearing the end of his presidency, had changed completely. No longer driven solely by ambition or power, he was a man whose heart had been softened by the grace of God. He had come to see his role not as a political leader, but as a servant of the people, a protector of faith. He met with leaders from all over the world, spiritual leaders, military leaders, politicians, to unite them under the banner of faith, hope, and love. Despite the pressure, despite the continued trials, Trump remained resolute. He began to speak openly about his faith, sharing his testimony of how Jesus had sustained him through the hardest of times. His voice, once brash and bold, now carried the weight of humility. The nation, still divided in many ways, began to heal slowly as people saw in their leader someone who had been humbled by the grace of God. In her moments of deepest reflection, Lena would often pray for the future. She understood now that the role she had played, though significant, was but a part of something much larger. God had used her to reach the highest offices of power, but the real work was in the hearts of every individual, in every family, in every town. It was the work of building up the body of Christ, of standing firm in the face of darkness, and of sharing the light of Jesus with a world that so desperately needed it. As the years went on, Lena's name became synonymous with hope, faith, and resilience. Her story was told in churches, schools, and communities. And though the political landscape had shifted, the work that had begun in those dark days continued. It wasn't about a single election or a single presidency, it was about something greater, the work of the kingdom of God on earth. Lena knew that the future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the battle would continue. The enemy would not give up. But as long as there were believers who stood firm, who walked in faith, and who prayed with all their hearts, the light would always find a way to pierce through the darkness. One day, Lena received a letter from Trump himself. It was simple, yet profound. It read, "Lena, I am forever grateful for your faith, your guidance, and the strength you showed me. You were a beacon of light when I needed it most. I don't know where the future will take us, but I do know this: we are not alone. God is with us, and together we will stand strong, always." Lena folded the letter carefully, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knew that the journey wasn't over yet. The battle was far from finished. But for the first time in her life, she felt a deep peace. The kind of peace that comes when you know you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing the work you were always meant to do. In that moment, she realized that she too had been transformed. She was no longer just a messenger, she was a warrior, standing side by side with those who had gone before her and with those who would come after. Together, they would continue the fight for America, for faith, and for the kingdom of God.